Hello, everybody. As 2025 winds down, what we're doing on Keen in America is having some conversations with some of the show's old and most respected friends to talk about 2025 and what perhaps to expect in 2026. Martin Wolf is one of the world's most trusted economists. Not that anyone trusts anyone these days. He's the chief economics commentator on the Financial Times and a man who spends his life analyzing the world's economy. I wrote an interesting piece, I think back in October of this year. He talked about the world economy is in an age of disorder, and he noted that the two central features of that disorder was the abdication of the United States as the world's economic hegemon and the rise of IA. Martin is joining us now from a rather dark London. Martin, is that the story of 2025, the abdication of the US as the world's economic hegemon and the rise of IA?
Yes.
Not IA, AI, whoops.
I assume you mean AI. But I think that is the big headline. We are going essentially through a period of extraordinary geopolitical revolution, I think. Disorder is obviously a dimension of that, but basically a revolution. And we have a bright new technology, which is carrying all before it, at least in terms of the commentary, and clearly in terms of the money being invested in it. Whether it is a profitable business, we don't yet know, and how it will affect our societies and our economies, I think we also don't know, which is pretty exciting. And the conclusion from both is we really don't know, I think, what comes next.
Martin, you're talking to me from a dark London. I'm in a sunnier San Francisco. When last time I went outside, there was no revolution in the streets. I'm guessing there isn't one at the FT offices in the city of London. You use the R word, revolution. Where's the evidence that we really are living in revolutionary times?
Well, I think revolutions just basically means things are overturned. They don't require violence. They may be accompanied by violence, but I think an order, a geopolitical order, can change peacefully. Why not? Suddenly you realize things are different from what they used to be in quite important ways. So I think this is a relatively slow motion upheaval, at least so far. The main participants, I think all the participants, with the possible exception of Russia, are really not interested in war at all, either domestic or international. So it looks quite possible that it will be peaceful in the sense that it won't actually mean blood in the streets. But at the end of it, trade relations might change, economic relations might have changed, who is in charge might have changed, political orders themselves might have changed. In fact, it seems to be pretty obvious they are changing. So an upheaval without mass violence is probably a relatively pleasant upheaval, relatively pleasant, but it's still an upheaval.
What are the historical analogies then for what happened, what is happening in 2025? And I'm sure you will argue what will continue to happen in 2026.
Well, first, before I answer that, at this stage, it's quite difficult to know what is a good analogy, because we have no idea where this ends up. But I think, to me, it feels as though, and the time periods are quite different, since 2007-8, which I think was a crucial period, the global financial crisis, we've been going through a slow motion, very slow motion version of the interwar period, and of successive economic and political upheavals, and in which the world order changed really very, very profoundly, but it wasn't quite clear how much it had changed until after World War II, and please God we don't end up with the equivalence of that. But that's what I think is is going on. Economic events have combined with political events to make quite clear the end of the old pre-First World War liberal economic order, which Keynes famously wrote about in the Economic Consequences of the Peace, and the birth of something new, but we didn't know, of course, in the 1930s what that new order would turn out to be.
So where are we then, if the analogy is the interwar period? Are we still in the Roaring '20s?
Well, I think we are. No analogy is perfect, so we didn't start with a world war, thank heavens, as theirs did. Economically, it's as though the Great Depression, we didn't have a Great Depression, but a very deep recession, and the COVID crisis, which sort of collapsed together in a sense, in making this comparison, has been followed by the Roaring '20s, and of course it also came after what was really the Roaring '90s. So we've had two big periods of booming stock markets related to technological transformations. But we've also seen, and that's the other dimension of this sort of very loose parallels, political change, profound political changes. So I think in a very different way, Donald Trump, particularly second arrival, is as revolutionary politically for America and potentially the world as FDR was. FDR changed America profoundly, creating the post-war order. His successors created the post-war order. Donald Trump is dismantling that order. What will follow it is quite unclear, but I think it's this combination of economic change, with technology very important in the 20s and 30s, really important, and the economic and technological changes now interacting with political transformation that makes it feel as comprehensive, if you like, a set of changes as that time. I'm not making any stronger parallels, but it's not business as usual. This seems to me very, very clear.
Yeah, and the absence of business as usual is reflected in your last book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. You were on the show this year talking about it. It's interesting, Martin, that you compare Trump with FDR in a sort of metaphorical sense, at least. We did a show earlier this week, actually, on that, suggesting that Trump, like FDR, sought much more presidential power. But making the analogy with the interwar period, I wonder whether one could compare Trump or Trump's America with Harding's America, and the level of corruption and the potential for some sort of major Teapot Dome style scandal that will bring the regime down.
I think that parallel is a very interesting one, and it has a lot of sense to me. I mean, one of the clear features of the Trumpian counter-revolution, is what I think of it, is to dismantle the administrative state, which FDR really did and his successors created, to take the United States out of the world as the liberal hegemon, as we discussed at the beginning, and to treat the government as a sort of personal fiefdom, not just in the sense of, my word is law, I do what I want, but also, as you said, at least from this side of the Atlantic, it looks like egregious corruption and using the power of the state to reward himself, his family, and his friends. So the echoes there are very obvious. And again, but the revolution is a counter-revolution. It is to go back to the past. After all, the movement he leads is called Make America Great Again. It's by definition a reactionary idea. And I think he's trying to undo a lot of things that the FDR regime created over time with his successors. And but to do so, of course, he has to exercise an enormous amount of personal power. So in that sense, there is an obvious parallel, but the direction is very different, and what he's trying to create is very different.
And if there is going to be another Teapot Dome level corruption scandal associated with the Trump administration, it probably will be associated with crypto, won't it, Martin?
Well, it's certainly plausible, though there seem to be so many opportunities. And I don't know what would really cut through politically in America anymore. I don't think I understand any of that at all.
When you say you don't understand it politically or economically, I mean,
I don't understand what would make Americans shocked. Because obviously, for a scandal to really make a difference, I've just been listening to an American who teaches here in Oxford, who's just producing a book on this very question: when do scandals cut through? I think it's published next month. A man called, I think, Pepper Culpepper. Anyway, the point is that what sort of scandal would cut through? I think it's pretty scandalous that, as far as I can see, the decision to allow NVIDIA's chips to be sold freely in China, which is seen as the great rival, where this is a crucial technology, seems to be all related to how much money is being raised. But obviously, crypto has the potential, if things go very, very badly wrong, to lose an enormous number of people, an enormous amount.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of the patrimonial quality. We've done some shows this year on the patrimonialism of the Trump administration. Exactly. The fact that the family is so heavily involved, the wife, the sons. What brought Harding down, of course, or what undermined his regime, was the corruption of his associates, and may have involved him or not. So there seems to be, just as the Trump regime is premised on a kind of reactionary patrimonialism, I'm guessing that if there is going to be a corruption scandal, it will be patrimonial.
Yes, clearly. Well, there seems to be a combination, and I'm not an expert on these scandals. I've read quite a bit about them, but a combination of a coterie around him doing well, the promotion of the interests of some important American businesses, and the family. And it's sort of a complicated interrelationship here. And I would have thought, particularly, and this is why crypto is interesting, crypto looks to me the most plausible area where lots of relatively ordinary people might lose a lot of money. And that is likely to make people notice. And that might also be relevant. But
it'd be interesting to see whether Trump will throw his wife and his boys under the bus. Probably would. Let's talk more, Martin, about the comparison with the 20s. Of course, if we compare Trump to Harding, that's the pre-Great Crash. Lots of talk this year, probably gets on your nerves these days on the bubble. Every day someone's probably asking you whether or not there's a bubble. If the comparison is with the 20s, how relevant is the Great Crash? I assume it hasn't happened yet.
Well, we flirted with a Great Crash after the dot-com bubble. It was delayed then into the 87 to 89. So we've been in this sort of territory. The big difference, and we don't know how this will ultimately play out, is that our governments, and I mean this on both sides, Democrats and Republicans and elsewhere in the world, have got very, very good at using the central bank to pour money into the system to prevent great crashes, and fiscal policy too. So as long as that's the case, I don't think another great crash is plausible. It's far more likely to be a long lingering consequences of yet another big stock market crash. But the Great Crash example, that required so many things to go wrong. Now, is that impossible? No, because we know that the government is flirting with territory. I don't think it's anywhere near there, where basically people might start deciding we want to flee from the dollar. We just don't think your money is safe anymore. And we don't want to invest in your money. If that happens, the degrees of freedom of the US government will be substantially curtailed and managing a trade crash will become difficult. But I don't think we're anywhere near that yet. As long as they can still rely on the printing press, and I'm taking for granted that who will next be the next head of the Fed will be very, very clearly there to use the printing press if necessary. I think they are very unlikely to have a great crash. A great inflation seems to me somewhat more plausible.
You've been pretty pessimistic in terms of your columns. I think you were on a show earlier this year in the summer talking about the coming fall of the US economy. You've talked about the damage that Trump's tariffs will impose on the world. But has it been such a dark year for the global economy in 2025? It seems as if there hasn't, certainly the US economy hasn't fallen. And there doesn't seem to be that many there's that much self-evident proof of the damage of Trump's tariffs, or am I wrong?
I don't even remember what I said in the interview with Yascha Mounk. I can never remember what I said in podcasts.
Well, his title said that you were talking about the coming. It doesn't say that you believe there was a coming fall. It's Martin Wolf on the coming fall of the US economy. You know, headline writers, Martin, they often take liberties.
They're so unsound, aren't they? And it was somebody else. So my general view, there are two separate elements here. I think the policies that have been adopted will worsen global economic growth somewhat. The major effects of trade policies like this are to create more uncertainty and to make the world economy less efficient. That's not the same thing as a great crash. I think the policies we discussed earlier, the corruption in the United States, what's been the pressure on the Federal Reserve, the erosion of the rule of law, the attack on institutions of research, all these things will have long-run effects on the growth of the US economy, but they're certainly not short-term. I don't believe that they're going to be short-term effects at all. I do think that there was the potential of the trade war as it was on April the 2nd to do much more short-term damage. And that was very much I responded to at once. But in fact, they reversed a lot of it. In the end, the trade policy, the tariffs were significant, there's no question, but nowhere near the levels initially announced. And though there was clearly an effect on optimism, if you look at growth forecasts in the course of the year, they fell for some months, and then it began to become obvious that the ultimate trade policy will be less damaging, far less damaging than what was initially announced, and people got more optimistic. Though actually, I was just looking at this, the consensus forecast for the US for 2025 now is still below where it was at the beginning of this year. So it did not go all the way back. But I think the long run effect of what has happened is to make the US less trustworthy, China appear more trustworthy, to diminish the growth of world trade. I think that's inevitable, and it will have effects on growth in the long term. And I think when we look back on this 5-10 years from now, we will see that this was significantly damaging for the US. And I remain of the view, and I've made this point several times, that if we look back now, I think China is the winner.
Well, you mentioned the C word a couple of times. You wrote a piece a couple of months ago announcing that the old global economic order is dead. What kind of year has it been for two questions on China. What kind of year has it been for the Chinese economy? We've done lots of shows. Seems to be some disagreement amongst China watchers about the strength of the Chinese economy. So what kind of domestic year has it been for the Chinese economy? And how has China improved in its competition with the United States for global hegemony?
Well, one of the columns I wrote, which I was particularly pleased by, even in retrospect, they vary, is one in which I said that we've got these two global superpowers. They're both predatory, though in different ways, and both have really serious problems. And I've discussed some of the serious problems right now in the US, and particularly with this administration. If you look at China, it has great, I think, obvious strengths which have turned out to be very substantial, but also really big weaknesses. And working out how that will play out is very difficult because both are so obvious. On the strength side, I think the honest truth is that they have achieved substantial technological dominance in some very, very important areas. Their power over critical minerals, rare earths, has turned out to be really valuable, and they made that very, very clear with their policies. And let's be clear, Trump backed down. Crucially, they are completely dominant globally in what has come to be called clean tech, the new clean energy and clean transport systems. Now, Trump has decided that's utterly unimportant. I think that's the future. So just for economic reasons, that's a tremendous source of strength for China. They have done incredibly well in artificial intelligence, continue to show a capacity to innovate in this area. So they are clearly, their resources, their ability to invest is extraordinary. At the same time, they have real problems with domestic demand. They are far too reliant on exports and on continuing investment, a lot of it with low return. They haven't really dealt with the aftermath of their huge real estate bubble, which is going to be a predictable problem. So they have also very clear weaknesses. And what will happen, I think, in both cases will depend on policy decisions made by the US administration and future US administrations and the Chinese government still to come. Right now, we can describe, I think, perfectly good histories for both countries in which they have real problems. But I think what China has got out of this, apart from the demonstration of its real strengths, which should not be ignored in any way, is that well, they have emerged looking more trustworthy. And right now, a year ago, I thought India was clearly in the US circle. Now it's pretty obvious that India is somewhere in between. And India is going to be and continues to be the fastest growing large economy in the world. So I think in terms of the great, if you like, the geopolitics of where we are, China comes out as a relative winner. The US is a relative loser. And the very fact that it keeps telling us that what it really cares about is relations with South America, which really has very little geopolitical importance compared to Asia, underlines for me that the Chinese are looking pretty comfortable if they don't screw it up completely.
Yeah, in a way, it's a return to the 19th century. It's all very interesting, but for readers of Paul Kennedy or other books, Martin, on the rise and fall of great powers, it doesn't seem very revolutionary. I mean, it's in the nature of things that one great power rises and one falls, isn't it?
Well, as I said, it's counter-revolutionary. There was an idea of what had happened since the Second World War, that the United States was the leading power of a coalition of liberal democracies. They were engaged in a existential struggle with communism, and they won decisively, overwhelmingly. And at the end of that, their system of government, democracy, and their system of economics, free trade, liberal market economy, was triumphant, and we were living in the unipolar moment. And you will remember that was the case, and it wasn't much more than 20 years ago.
End of history, blah, 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 right?
Exactly. Well, that was even earlier, my friend Frank Fukuyama. So that was the story, as it were, we were telling ourselves about what had happened after the catastrophe of the interwar period in the Second World War, which was where we started. Now, that's not a story we will tell now, because the Western world, which was supposed to have been triumphant, is fragmented. The new national security strategy of the US makes that absolutely clear. The US is withdrawing from those roles and playing essentially a non-hegemonic role, exploiting opportunities, but not really having any of those sorts of ambitions. The liberal world order, as created by the West, is fading very quickly. The authoritarians are doing very well, Russia, China, and so forth. And the
very well in what sense?
Very well in the sense that, well, first of all, not Russia, but China is growing much faster than the West. We tend to note not to notice this, but China is still growing at about 4 or 5% a year. Now, you can maybe it's 3. There's a big debate about it, but still clearly much faster than Western countries. Russia looks like winning its war in Ukraine. We don't know where that will go from here. NATO is clearly disintegrating. And the liberal world order, well, a core element of that was the trading system, and the trade system, as is created, above all, symbolized in the creation of the World Trade Organization in the middle of the 90s, is gone. That all the rules there have gone. So in that sense, it is a counter-revolution. And we're moving into a world which is anarchic. Now, in that anarchic world, everybody does their best. Everything doesn't change at once. It's very, very slow process. We can't see how different countries will change their policies. Will they move away from the dollar? I think they will, but slowly with difficulty. But it's not going to be quick. We're moving to a long-term period of relative disorder. And the counter-revolution consists of a move from what seemed an orderly system of relations among states built around broadly defined liberal ideas into a world, as you said, of 19th century great powers, anarchic, amoral, patrimonial, and the full implications of that we can't possibly know, because the very nature of this change is a series of adjustments to the disorder in which countries find themselves. That is a counter-revolution, but the counter-revolution can go at any speed you want to imagine. I think it looks at the moment as though it'll be very slow, but of course it could quite suddenly accelerate if there's some big event, which at the moment we can't imagine.
And history repeats itself in some ways, of course, but in other ways it doesn't. You've written extensively over the year on the challenges and problems with the power of tech platforms. There's no equivalent of the power of companies like NVIDIA and Google and even OpenAI in the 19th century, or even in the interwar period, whereas the American economy seems to be, if not in crisis, certainly not at its greatest strength. These big 7 companies make up whatever the numbers are, some astonishing number, not just of the US economy, but of the global economy. How does that change everything? And has that been another of the more salient economic features of 2025, Martin? The continual power driving Wall Street, driving the AI revolution?
I think that this is really fascinating. I mean, if you're a good Marxist, you would say, well, it's always been like this. I was thinking immediately, so there are separate elements of this. First of all, periods of vast corporate power are not new. They're just different corporations. And the most powerful company in the world in the late 18th and early 19th century was the East India Company. And the East India Company took over the whole of India, which you have to admit, which was a huge,
pretty big deal, yeah. And Dalrymple has been on the show. He has that excellent book on the East India Company.
So none of these tech companies have yet, though they've got getting close to it, taken over a whole country. We'll come to that in.
They could if they wanted to. It's just not in their interest.
We'll get to that. But I think in the heyday, I can still remember more or less. I was born a little bit afterwards, but the line that what's good for General Motors is good for the United States. There were very dominant companies in the automobile industry in the middle of the 20th century. There were, of course, some extraordinarily powerful financial institutions as well. So I don't think it's that new. What is different, it seems to me, well, different-ish, is you've got a group of companies which dominate frontier technology, huge companies. So if you compare it with the dot-com boom, most of the companies engaged at that time were actually very small. We didn't have dominant tech companies in that way. None of them had the role this group of companies had. So we've got companies that have already existed, with few exceptions, for quite a long time. They were already gigantic, and they're now moving into a new technology, putting vast resources into it, which people believe will be transformative. That combination of being at the frontier of technology and also already gigantic is, at least to me, somewhat new. And I think that's the first thing. And the second element is obviously because of the nature of the American government of today and the personalities involved, they have extraordinary influence of public policy. My colleague Ed Luce wrote a column this week, seems to me correct, that if you think of the Trump administration as a war, as it were, between the MAGA base and the Broligarchs, the brotherhood of that runs the tech sector, well, it looks as though the latter is in charge. And in the process, they've gained, of course, enormous influence over American policy, and the United States government is using its power to shape the world in the interests of these oligarchs. That combination of their huge existing resources, their position at the frontier of new technology, and their control, apparently, over the most powerful government in the world is, I think, at least in the extent of it, new. And that, to my mind, it's completely terrifying and absolutely incompatible with the survival of democracy. But that is, I think, where I would agree. That combination is something new, and certainly in its extent, feels to me something new.
What isn't new, Martin? You're talking to me from a rather damp, grey, dismal London. Is the British economy? You've written extensively on it. One of your last pieces was on the UK must do more than keeping on muddling through. Muddling through is the story of post-Second World War, probably 20th century Britain. You've written about what Reeves and Starmer should do next. Has it been a pretty miserable year for the UK? What's it like living in London?
Actually, I've just been looking at it. I mean, our growth rate this year is expected to be, I think, about 1.3%. I mean, in the low ones. But actually, by European standards, it's relatively high this year. So actually, it's a pretty damn miserable continent. And then this explains in part why so many Americans now despise it, as came out so very clearly in the new strategic document. I would say the economy is poor, but not by European standards catastrophic. The problem is that it's been like this, that was the core of this recent article, since the financial crisis. And the salient characteristic of Britain is that from 1980 to 2007, though this is not widely recognized, UK was a little bit ahead of the US, but it was the economy with the fastest growth of GDP per head of the G7. And that was the only period since the war when that was true. In the earlier years after the Second World War, that wasn't true at all. We were way behind the continental countries and, of course, Japan. And now we're way behind the US. But the decline in the growth rate from the 1980 to 2007 years to the post-2007 years, when it's been well below 1% a year in GDP per head, is actually the decline was 1.8 percentage points on average a year, roughly speaking. That decline has been exceptional, and that means that people are terribly disappointed. Real living standards have been stagnant. Tax revenues are tight. Managing fiscal policy is depressing and makes people depressed. And while the growth this year isn't so bad, nobody really thinks there's going to be a serious upswing. So I would say it's the fall from what seemed, relatively speaking, grace up to 2007 that has been most depressing for the UK.
Any predictions politically on the UK in 2026? Well, is Farage a viable prime minister? Can Starmer save himself? Will he still be prime minister this time next year?
I think there was two different questions. I'm assuming that whatever happens, since the Labour Party has a gigantic majority, that we won't have Mr. Farage, Nigel Farage, as prime minister in 2026. That would be truly extraordinary. The Labour Party would have to split completely and no longer function. I don't think that will happen. But my colleagues who follow these much more closely than I do think that there is a reasonable chance that as it becomes sort of more obvious that Labour is heading for a disaster, which is what the polls suggest, that the party will, though they're historically been nothing like as ruthless as the Conservatives, will in fact turn on Starmer, which means Rachel Reeves will go too, and we'd have a new leader, probably more left-wing leader. Most people are talking about Angela Rayner, former deputy leader. Then there's the question of when we get to the next election, which is certainly going to be further ahead, will it be Nigel Farage who wins? I really don't know. I find it very extraordinary because his one signature policy has been Brexit. And as I pointed out in many pieces, Brexit has been a disaster for Britain. But it's possible, it is possible that in the Conservative Party's riven, weak, desperately unpopular after a long period of poor government, everybody's had enough of Labour. Well, maybe we will end up with Nigel Farage. I think it would almost certainly be a disaster, but that's some years ahead. But if I were told that a year from now, Keir Starmer is no longer prime minister, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not predicting, but I wouldn't be surprised. People have had enough of the politicians they now have. I understand that even in Trump land, as it were, Mr. Trump is getting less popular. People sort of don't like their leaders right now.
Martin, and former British Prime Minister Harold Wilson famously said that a week is a long time in British politics or in politics. Is a year a long time for a chief economics commentator of the FT? When we think about 2026, I'm not going to ask you for any inane predictions because I know you're too smart to make them. But when you think about a year, is it a long time? I mean, when I hope you and I have this conversation again next year, what's the most we can hope for in terms of structural economic change, as opposed to prime ministers coming or going, or some bomb or some other unexpected event that we can't predict?
I have a line which I don't think I've ever written, but I use it sometimes, is that the really important thing to understand about economies is that they don't crash upwards. So if you think about it, it's easy enough to think of crisis events that actually affect the economy very, very quickly. So a pandemic, we've seen that. A war, a really big war, would affect an economy very quickly. A huge stock market crash can affect the economy very quickly. So there are events that mean if one of these things are going to happen, the economy a year from now could genuinely be really, really different. The problem with that is these sorts of events are really unforecastable. You can say there are certain possibilities, but you can't say, I promise you that not at least credibly, that in June there'll be a stock market crash and it'll lose half its value. I'm not saying it's impossible, but we can't. But so those possibilities have to be in one's mind, and it's sensible to do so. But on the other side, positive news. Think of AI itself. When will AI really, if it really works out, transform the dynamic of our economies? It'll be over years. So my view is we know roughly how fast the world economy is growing in normal times. It's basically what we're doing in recent years. It's slower than it was before the global financial crisis for all sorts of fundamental reasons. And I don't see any reason for the upside to be vastly different from what we're seeing now. The growth rates were going to be continue to be roughly what we've been seeing, which is not very thrilling, but just about bearable. With China growing at maybe 4, 5, India growing 6, 6.5, America maybe 2, maybe a bit more, Europe 1% or less. That sort of seems the picture. And I don't see why that should change in the next year. But it's certainly not impossible to think about some things that could go very seriously wrong. Major wars are always possible. Big economic crises are always possible. The trade war could really go stratospheric by mistake. I don't think it's likely. But my general view is the next year is likely to be more of the same. Not very exciting for most people, but just about manageable with the same AI talk. I don't think that will change over that period. Might, but unlikely. So I'm a more of the same person. I think the likelihood of a complete breakdown of the world economy because the tariff war, the trade war goes crazy, or everybody dumps the dollar is, in both cases, they now look to me low. So I think it's basically more patrimonial state, more corruption, more continuing problems with China's exports, more AI technology, but nothing decisively different. That seems to me far and away the most likely, because I think we've gotten through the period when Trump might do something really hugely disruptive. That's been contained, maybe by Scott Bessent, maybe by events. But there are wild cards out there.
Yeah, and of course, if the elections next year go against Trump, it's more likely. In other words, Martin, the world will become like the UK. It will just muddle through. What's the best scenario? Do you think by this time next year, the abundance agenda, the debate, I think, triggered by the work of people like Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson, I'm sure you have similar conversations in the UK, that people will begin to be taking the abundance agenda and the possibilities of abundance being caused by AI more seriously?
I think it's a combination. AI is important. I actually think clean tech is more important, certainly as important. I think we could, I stress could, be moving into a world when, through technological change, we're going to live in an era when we've got essentially inexhaustible energy, because we can use solar energy combined with batteries so much better.
Yeah, and Bill McKibben, I'm sure you know his latest book, Here Comes the Sun. He was on the show earlier this year. Yeah. Of all the people to be optimistic, you wouldn't expect McKibben, but he actually is.
Yes, I think that is a possibility. That the combination of the technological revolution in clean tech and AI might be really dramatic over the years. It's not going to be tomorrow. It's going to create huge technological investments to make this work. And what's more, I think the abundance agenda, if it works, could make our politics much better, because it will make, and that was the big point of Ezra Klein and the Klein-Thompson book, and which I rate very highly, that's something that we could, everywhere, a new center could be built around that. It brings us back more to the sort of politics we had in the post-war period, when everybody could get better off. We don't have, politics becomes less zero-sum. The sort of populist politics we've seen associated with Trump and people like that would just become less popular, because it doesn't work and it makes people very angry and depressed. And people will get, the next round of leaders will be people who are optimists, who tell us, well, we can all live together well, we can all have a enjoyable life, and we don't have to get into this terrible cycle of authoritarianism and fear. I would be enchanted if that's the future. And I think now, looking around at these technological changes and the truth that it seems to me that the Trump administration is not really doing very well with what it has, that maybe we will move into an environment in which, on both sides of the political divide, we sort of converge on the more sensible agenda of making people feel happier. What's wrong with that?
Well, Martin Wolf, I can maybe the headline will be Martin Wolf says 2026 will be more cheerful. I know you do a show with Paul Krugman, who always seems particularly miserable economist. You did a show recently about the misery of men. So is it possible then we'll be a little bit more cheerful, Martin, by this time next year when you and I talk again?
I think if we look at where we are now, I think you've got to a point where either we persist on this very negative, very reactionary, men against women, racial conflict, all this will get worse, which will be absolutely ghastly, or we sort of say, actually, we don't really like this very much, and we would like leaders. And one of the things I liked about Mr. Mandami, he's an optimist. He thinks things can be made better. And that's the sort of politics I would like to see. It was the politics of my childhood and early adulthood in the 50s and 60s. And I see no reason why that shouldn't happen. And maybe, as you say, the midterms will be the beginning of that. And it will be politics, I hope, by younger people. My God, we want to see politicians in their 40s and 50s, not in their 80s. And so I think this could happen. I think actually it's the right way for China to go.
Yeah, maybe comparing the appropriate comparison with FDR is Mandami. Well, on that very cheerful note, Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times, one of the wisest and most sensible men in the world. Happy New Year, Martin. A healthy New Year as well. And we will talk in the new year. Enjoy your time off. I know you're a big Italy lover. Enjoy your holiday, and we will rely on your wisdom for 2026. Thank you so much.